So now on to some Italian Baroque painters, and we're going to start out with Caravaggio. And I mentioned in another of the previous lectures that Caravaggio's actual name was Michelangelo, but I'm sure you know why he didn't really want to go by that name, right? So he went by Caravaggio as a nickname. And his background, funny enough, is kind of similar to Michelangelo's, where they both were supposedly very distasteful people who got in fights and were difficult. And Caravaggio actually was killed in a bar fight. So that was how he went out. So supposedly he was a very disagreeable person to a certain extent. But funny enough, he was one of the most sought after painters of his time. So just like Michelangelo, I think that people would often put aside their feelings about his personality because his artwork was so divine. So they were like, oh, well, he's kind of a jerk, but what's to be done about it? He does great art. He's mainly known for his religious paintings in art history, but I'll also show you some of the paintings he was doing in private that maybe got people's hackles up a little bit. But these are the works that he's very well known for, which are these larger scale religious pieces. I'm going to show you the Conversion of St. Paul here, and then also the Crucifixion of St. Peter as well. And when I talk about Caravaggio's style, I use him as really the developer and the marker of the style. So when I think about just Baroque painting in general, I always trace it all the way back to Caravaggio. You can see Caravaggio's influence ripple outwards. You can see it ripple out to the Dutch. So when we talk about the Dutch, I'll bring up the idea of Caravaggio again and his influence. And you can see it in the French too. So he really has this widespread influence to the point where people say, that other painter, they were using a Caravaggio-esque style. So they're painting in the style of Caravaggio. So his impact on Baroque painting was tremendous. And here's how I define his style. There's really 4 markers of his style that other Baroque painters will then use. The first is that dark black background, where there's nothing back there to see, there's nothing back there to distract you as a viewer. It's simply this dark black background. Now think back to Renaissance paintings in linear perspective. They always tried to make you have depth in the background or see depth in the background or make your eye recede into the background. And often there was a lot back there in the background for you to see. Here, Caravaggio does not want to focus on the background, which leads you to the second marker, which is that he pushes everything to what we call the front of the picture plane. The picture plane is the front of the painting. So you'll notice when you look at a painting, you can either see a lot of depth or recession into space, so things are further away from the picture plane, the front of the picture plane, or you can look at a painting like this where everything is shoved really far up to what we call the front of the picture plane. So you'll notice that Caravaggio, once again, does not want distractions. So he couples everything to the front of the picture plane with that dark black background. So there's nothing to distract you. Everything's right there in front of you, and you're looking right at it. The third marker is almost what I call the spotlight effect, where if you look at the light source, you'll notice that there's almost this spotlight effect that happens over the painting, where everything is lit up in this very specific but diffuse way. When we're not really sure where the light source is coming from, it almost looks like a spotlight off stage shining on the subjects. So that's why I always kind of compare these paintings sometimes to almost looking like something that's happening on a theater stage. There's this appearance, right, of you almost like watching a drama unfold before you. And then the fourth marker is the use of diagonals in the composition. And the next painting I'm going to show you, it's a little bit more obvious to see this. So I'll point that out more vigorously, right, when we look at that painting. So again, the 4 markers, right, dark black backgrounds, everything to the front of the picture plane, spotlight effect, and diagonals. Those are the hallmarks of Caravaggio-esque style. The subject matter here, as I mentioned, is a religious painting. It's the conversion of Saul to Paul on the road to Damascus. So in the religious story, Saul was basically sent out by the Romans to collect taxes and, do his Roman duties. The story is that he's hit by the light of God. He falls from his horse and he sees the Christian light, might we say. And he's converted, right? He becomes Christian. What people were struck by with Caravaggio's paintings is that this was not the usual way you typically would see a religious work done. That there wasn't this sense of like angels flying down and a lot of like over-the-top drama that you probably would have seen in like a Renaissance painting. That it almost seems very specific and very local and very laser focused, right, on Paul. There's nothing to distract you from anything but what's going on with him. And it almost seems like a pedestrian or everyday way of showing this, to the point where the horse is almost about to step on him, you know? So people are like, it was really interesting to them how he was choosing to work with these religious subjects. Same thing here with Crucifixion of St. Peter, where people talk about like the dirty foot of the person on the bottom pushing on the cross, and how there are these little details in the paintings that make it seem more accessible and less counter-Reformation over-the-top drama in the Renaissance fashion. That this is a different kind of drama that you're seeing here, a more everyday pedestrian kind of drama. So I always think it's interesting to explore, you know, again, how he's grappling with a religious subject, but in a way that's not about the same type of drama and celebration that you see in a Renaissance work. So, and again, if you look at this painting, you'll notice the 4 hallmarks. Dark black background, everything very close to the picture plane or front of the picture plane. Spotlight. And then here, I think the diagonal obviously is way more easy to pick up. You'll actually notice that there are multiple diagonals. And when we talk about diagonals in composition, like how you're making a painting, we talk about how diagonals make energy and motion in a painting. It makes your eye follow the diagonals in this dramatic way. You can go look at something like linear perspective, and linear perspective is usually about stillness, where here diagonals are about motion and energy. So again, it's a very different way of composing a work. Excuse me. That's a very different way of putting an artwork right together. So again, you get this sort of energy and motion through the use of diagonal. Now, if you don't know anything about the story, excuse me again. If you don't know anything about the story, the Crucifixion of St. Peter, Peter took over, in a sense, the church from Christ upon his crucifixion and became, in a sense, the first pope, we say. There's the famous idea of Christ giving the keys to St. Peter, the keys of the church to St. Peter. Peter, unfortunately, then suffers the same fate as Christ, and he wants to be crucified upside down, because he says, you know, I'm not worthy of dying in the same way as my Savior. So he asks them to honor him and Christ through crucifying him upside down, and they agree. So that's why you see him being pulled into an upside down position on the cross during his crucifixion. But people point out, you know, that this again is a much more intimate depiction of this subject matter, and that Caravaggio is kind of changing the game with how he's going at a religious subject. Now, the other side of Caravaggio that a lot of people don't know about is the paintings that he did linked to his sexuality. He was openly homosexual, and at this time, you know, Catholicism was still a very important, religious, orientation in Italy. To be openly homosexual was very shocking at this time. Most people, if they were homosexual, they hid it, but he did not. And so he actually did different paintings of his various lovers and boyfriends. And we think that's why a lot of people didn't like him personally, is based on his sexual background and his openness about it. So he would do paintings like this one of like the idea of his boyfriend as Bacchus, the god of wine and pleasure, and would do these different pieces where he, was sort of working with the idea of these young lovers of his. And again, we think this is why a lot of people had some issue with him, where they loved his religious works, but they didn't like his personal background or his orientation sexually, and so that was part of the rub, we'd say, between him and others right at this time. There's a critic from this time who basically said he was the Antichrist of painting. So he often got, bad publicity and bad press about his personal attitudes, right? His personal leanings. So, but again, it's interesting to think about this sense of having his public persona and kind of his private persona, kind of, how they influenced one another at the end of the day. Final painter I want to show you here in the Italian Baroque is a favorite of mine. This is Artemisia Gentileschi. Artemisia Gentileschi is the first female painter that we're looking at in the class. And one of the first female artists that you really run into in art history. And why is this? This is because really women didn't have an avenue towards arts training. It was not something that was considered acceptable. So really, in the Renaissance period and then into the Baroque period, you start to see a few women trying to get artistic training, right? Trying to have that door open to them. But it was a very, very difficult road. So why do you see no women artists for a long time? It's because there was no opportunities for them. Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the reasons she was able to become a trained painter is because her father was a very famous Renaissance painter. So she was able to sort of, lobby off of his personality and background and reputation. And often he would have his students train her or work with her. But, there was still roadblocks for her because there's a story of him taking her to the art academy and basically taking a lot of her sketches and different things and wanting to gain her admission. And the people at the art academy being like, well, how do we know you didn't do this for her? How do we know you didn't make these things? So there was the sense that a woman couldn't be an artist. You must be lying for her, So he just decided to train her himself. But unfortunately, that leads to part of Artemisia Gentileschi's story, that one of her tutors, a man named Tassi, raped her. And she actually took him to trial for her rape. Now, there's different ways you can look at this story. There's different journals and different things you can read. Tassi's side of the story is sort of like they had, a mutual affair between one another, and Artemisia's was that it was very much rape. And so, when you read the court documents of sort of this unfolding at trial, there's this sort of he said, she said vibe going on, right, in the encounter. Now, what I find striking is that when you read the court documents, it's almost like she's on trial. So this idea of a woman bringing up a rape charge today would be very difficult. But the fact that she's doing this back in Baroque Italy, you have to really admire her strength in bringing this to light in an official court setting. And again, it's almost like she's on trial. They used thumb screws on her and tortured her and basically to see if she was lying about, her story, right? And why do I bring this up? Why do I talk about her biography? Because it directly influences the art that she makes. This is one of her favorite subjects that you're seeing here, which is Judith and Holofernes. And it's from an apocryphal story from the Bible, which is like a side story from the Bible, of an Assyrian general who occupied a Jewish town with his forces. And in the story, Judith is the heroine. She basically seduces him and gets him drunk, dead drunk to the point where she comes in with this sword and cuts his head off. To free or liberate her town, to free the Jews, essentially, that were part of her community. So a lot of people talk about, if you read her biography, that she, basically is put on trial, she's scorned, she's tortured. I'm sure she feels like painting this subject was about vindication, this was her ability to kill her tormentor, because I look at this painting and I'm like, that's basically her taking a sword to Tassi over and over and over again, because she painted this subject over and over and over again. And her portrait, her self-portrait, is on Judith's face. So, she used herself as the model for Judith, kind of this, liberator, saving her people from Holofernes. So I think her biography is very relevant to the painting that you're seeing. And if you think to Caravaggio's style, you can see it all here. It's well noted that Artemisia Gentileschi knew Caravaggio's style and used it. So black backgrounds, everything very close to the picture plane, right? Spotlights, diagonals, you have it all here. And it's a very energetic piece. When I look at these two women, I'm like, these are women who are unemotional. They're just getting the job done. They're like, okay, this has to happen. We need to kill this guy. Let's get to work, right? And I always show you as a contrast Caravaggio's version to have you sort of think about, how a male artist would maybe paint this and then how a female artist would paint this. And again, she loved this painting. She did different versions of it at different points of the narrative. Here's Caravaggio's version to the right. Notice that his Judith is very girl-like, youthful, almost delicate and dainty. The maid is like an old crone who's like, I probably couldn't be helpful if she needed help at all. There's something sort of stilted and posed about the whole thing. Where I look at Gentileschi's and it's like, again, it's these two women kind of settling in, rolling up their sleeves, right, to get this done and liberate their people. So again, I like to contrast sort of the female artist with a backstory against Caravaggio, who doesn't have any of that baggage that he's sort of handling in the painting. I find that when I look at Artemisia's work, I see a lot of wronged women. That again, I think her wrongedness, her sense of wanting justice for her violation, it comes through in a lot of the pieces that she does. This is another work, Susanna and the Elders, where it was about Susanna kind of being spied on when she was in her garden by these older kind of lecherous men, and then being accused of like sleeping with them and being wanton and slutty and whatnot, and it being a false accusation. So I think Gentileschi kind of moved through these subjects of wronged women, and as I mentioned, she often used her self-portrait as the characters, because I think she again felt very wronged in her own life. Notice that this is her self-portrait as martyr. So again, I think she carried along sort of the wronged feelings a bit and translated into the works that she was making.